By declaring an interest, I'm an advisor to the board of JCB. I mention that because they've really become, in practical terms, an Anglo-Indian company. Since my noble friend Lord Bamford made at that time, rather counter-cyclical decision in the 1970s to invest heavily in India, JCB has become an immense employer there, to the point that many Indians think of it as an Indian company, or at the very least they think of it in the same sense that they think of cricket as an essentially Indian institution that may technically happen to have been invented in the United Kingdom, but which is, in all practical senses, a largely Indian institution. And that company seems to me a symbol of what I'd like to talk about in the next couple of minutes, the opportunities for both our two countries, and why we need to seize the moment. The noble Lady Baroness Hayter spoke about, are we getting the timing right? I put it to you that we are getting the timing right both directly and in a more macro sense. What I mean by that is that for a long time, India was very slow to open its markets at all. Protectionism cast a very long shadow in India. Think of the Indian flag, right? That blue wheel in the middle, the chakra, right? That was a stylized form. You see this very clearly if you look at the flag of the old Congress Party, of the handloom. Right? The handloom of the kind that Gandhi used to carry around with him, because in his mind, independence and self-sufficiency were aspects of the same concept of Swaraj. And because of the moral stature of Gandhi, protectionist and mercantilist thinking lasted in India for decades longer than it otherwise would have done, greatly to the detriment of Indian citizens, particularly Indian citizens on low incomes. It was really only in this century that India began properly to open its markets and join the global economy, starting in its own region and then signing deals with ASEAN and more recently with Japan. And the result of this is that our share of Indian trade has fallen as those other countries have taken our place. In the years since the 2000, since the turn of the century, our goods exports as a share of the Indian total have fallen from 6% to 1.3%, our services exports from 11% to 2.1%. This is a remediable problem. There are institutional solutions to it. Indeed, I'd argue, my lords, that there is no country better placed than ours, certainly no Western country, to have a comprehensive and mutually beneficial trade deal with India. It's become commonplace in politics, almost a cliche, to talk about every group of migrants as enterprising. But actually, in this case, it's difficult to think of any migrant group anywhere in history that has been more enterprising, more business-focused, and has added more to the economy of the welcoming country than the 1.5 million Brits of Indian origin, dominating as they do are lists of successful entrepreneurs. And, if you like, there are plenty of reverse JCBs. British brands have been extremely popular, from Jaguar to Tetley, as targets for Indian investors. And that two-way investment rests on the most obvious congruities of language and law, habit and history, culture and kinship. What hasn't yet followed is the trade, because we have barriers. We have artificial government-imposed barriers between what would otherwise be a very natural commercial flow. If he was still alive, Gandhi would be astonished to discover that on the question of textiles, it's now the other way around. It's not Lancashire dominating the handloom industries of India. It's now Britain imposing, or having inherited at least from the EU, tariffs against Indian textiles, including a 9.3% tariff, for example, on men's shirts. And there are, of course, tariffs the other way, as the noble Lord the Earl of Sandwich reminded us, including on whisky, an extraordinary 150% tariff. Remember always, my lords, that tariffs do the most damage to the country that applies them. Yes, they do some incidental damage to the exporters of the other country, but the cost is paid by the citizens of the government that imposes them. Now, of course, removing these tariffs is a gain. It's an easy and demonstrable gain, but I don't think that that is where the biggest opportunities lie. We have to think like a 21st century economy, not a 19th century economy. The big gains are in tech, in engineering, in coding, and actually, yes, also in the mutual recognition of credentials and professional qualifications, and that will mean changes to our visa regime. And I can't believe that there isn't a deal to be done there. But what's tended to slow it up is that Britain has been pushing for more flexibility from the Indian government on taking back failed or illegal entrants into this country. India has been pressing for more work permits, more Tier 3 visas. Surely there is a landing zone there, right? It must be possible to hammer out a deal where it is easier for Indians to come here legally, but not so easy to come here illegally. That is something that both governments could easily trumpet as a victory. And as for doing it by Diwali, whether we're being too hasty, I think the best answer I heard on this was from my colleague on the Board of Trade, Tony Abbott, the former Australian Prime Minister. He was Prime Minister of that country fairly briefly, I think 18 months or so, and yet in those 18 months, he managed to sign fairly ambitious trade deals with China, with South Korea, and with Japan. And when I asked him what the secret was, he said it was to impose an iron deadline, because otherwise the trade negotiators on both sides would string it out indefinitely. They like process, they like being part of the process, and there is no incentive on them. And as my noble friend Lord Frost adds, there is, of course, then a constant open door to domestic lobbies to push for further additions or accretions to the deal. So I think it's extremely important to have a deal, to have a deadline, even if it is a deadline to have concluded the bulk of the talks, rather than a deadline for the ratification, which, of course, is a different question. And finally, on the issue that a number of noble lords have raised about the wider geopolitical orientation of India and the disappointing refusal of the Indian government to take sides on the Russia-Ukraine conflict, I share that disappointment. By the way, it's a common policy to, I think, every South Asian government. I think they've all taken exactly the same position on the Russia-Ukraine war. But it is especially disappointing from a state that tends to self-define as a democracy. Indians take justified pride in the fact that, unlike some of their neighbours, they have remained a law-based democracy since independence. Elections happen without anyone being exiled or shot. The army doesn't step in and take power. And it's therefore somewhat disappointing that India didn't take a stronger line on the Ukraine war, not as a favour to the West, but in accordance with its own values. But whereas some noble lords seem to see that as a reason to hang back or hesitate, I see it as the opposite. The orientation of India is perhaps the key geopolitical question of this century. If India primarily sees itself as an English-speaking democracy rather than just as an Asian superpower, then the world is an altogether brighter and warmer place. And we have been through a great deal together. The two largest volunteer armies in the history of the human race were the Indian armies in the First and Second World Wars, respectively 1.5 and 2.5 million volunteers. There was no conscription on either occasion. We have a living link made of the extraordinary enterprise brought here and the extraordinary contributions across our national life made by British people of Indian origin. I am certain that coming together as free and sovereign equals, we can restore what should be the natural traffic and commerce between two countries, bound by what my friend Professor Madhav Das Nalapat calls the blood of the mind, a shared habit, a shared way of looking at property and at commerce. And I'm sure that in that spirit, the best is to come.